So we have Biden, the European Commission. We have the master plan here, the global master plan. Then we have more or less, Wolfgang Müller said a lot, but Maidan was the main argument. And yeah, I forgot now what you said.
Yeah. Biden could choose a different course. He has been, however, on the path of NATO expansion for at least a quarter century. So this is not something new. This has been his campaign too. From the 1990s, he was one of the most gung-ho supporters of the military-industrial complex and of NATO enlargement as a senator. And in 2014, he played a personal role in the Maidan events. I think it's, so of course he should choose a different path. I was, by the way, an advisor to Mr. Borrell for a short time, unpaid, but official advisor. And then I said one day that I thought that the United States had destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline, and he fired me that day. So that is how my career as advisor to the European Union ended, by my statement, which I still stand by, that the United States most likely destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. The only competing theory now, by the way, is the one put forward by the United States, which is that Ukraine did it. So take your choice. But I think the United States probably did it, and it's probably not fair to blame Ukraine for this, but it's one or the other. It wasn't Russia. Everybody agrees that it wasn't Russia. In the U.S. intelligence community, their theory is it was Ukraine. That was in the New York Times a few days ago. My theory is Seymour Hersh account that the United States did this. In any event, that brought an end to my illustrious advising the European Commission on foreign policy, very abruptly, by the way. It took less than a day to end my career in that capacity. So I think Professor
Müller?
Müller, yes.
But that was the master plan before.
Yeah, I will also say just a word. I think many of our differences are about the Euro-Maidan. I don't think it's incidental that Victoria Nuland was on tape 3 weeks before the violent overthrow of the government, because it ended with a shooting from the Maidan-controlled buildings and a storming of the government buildings. It was a violent overthrow. And she was on tape describing exactly what the next government would be. So she was planning this change. And I happen to have some direct, odd experience with this. I know that significant U.S. money flowed into the Maidan in ways that are really wrong, seriously wrong. And the United States played a significant role in this. So I don't dispute, of course, that neutrality was not the issue at that point, except for the U.S., which opposed Yanukovych. Yanukovych wanted neutrality, but the U.S. wanted a government that supported NATO enlargement, and it got it in the end, because by the end of 2014, the government was now calling for joining NATO. Of course, you know very, very well as an expert in this that the first act of the parliament, though not implemented, was to ban the Russian language. This brought into... No, is that...
Never a ban of Russian language. It was a change of the language law for regional minority languages being officially accepted.
That's correct. We agree. Okay, we agree. Thank you for the clarification. On the U.S. and Europe, I admit my imagination is often not good enough to know what they really have in mind. I don't think this is an anti-Europe venture of the United States, but it is a hegemonic venture, clearly, because that's not even subtle. The idea of the United States is the United States should have full spectrum dominance in all regions of the world. That's the idea. And of course, the two threats to that perceived by the United States are Russia and China. And so the US foreign policy and strategic policy and defense policy are absolutely clear on these points. And I think that the basic idea is the US likes Europe well enough, but it absolutely wants full dominance over Eurasia. And that's what Zbig was talking about in the global chessboard, how to get full dominance over Eurasia. And he pointed out that control of Ukraine, he called it the geographic pivot of Eurasia. And that was the theory, and he spelled it out in detail, and I think it is the neoconservative vision that has been played out now for 30 years. So I don't think it's per se anti-European. It's not pro-European, it's pro-American. And it is, to my mind, extremely wrong-headed to think when you are 4.1% of the world population that you should run the world or aim to be the unrivaled power of the world, aim to have primacy everywhere. And there's so many vivid examples of how this thinking works. I'll give you one more that is interesting. A former colleague of mine, and then he became a very esteemed ambassador, Robert Blackwell, wrote in 2015 how the United States needed to confront China because China's rise was no longer in America's interest. And he spelled out all the measures that the United States should take to limit China's rise. And they're being followed one by one by one by one. For example, negotiate trade arrangements in Asia that exclude China. What a clever idea. Let's have trade in Asia, but not China, which is the main trade partner of all the Asian countries. Only America could invent such an idea. It's close your eyes, wish 3 times, and sprinkle fairy dust, and good things will happen to you. It's bizarre, but these things are actually spelled out in print and then followed. Ban exports of technology. This was on the list in 2015. Sanctions, using the financial system, setting the rules for various technologies and trade, all spelled out precisely. So this is the question that consumes our international relations specialists. It consumes the think tanks in Washington. It consumes the American leadership, how to stay number one, which is, to me, a very uninteresting question, except that it is so dangerous to have that mindset. And that is, unfortunately, where we are. In 1989, I was asked to be economic advisor to Poland's solidarity movement and then to its first post-communist government of Prime Minister Morawiecki. And I mentioned earlier, I drafted a plan for them, and I created a framework for financial stabilization. And I wrote various key steps of that because that was my specialty at the time, and how to stabilize the currency, how to stabilize the financial system, how to stabilize the money, and so forth. The US accepted everything I recommended. In fact, just to show you how it works, one day in September 1989, I had an idea for $1 billion stabilization fund to back the Polish currency. And I literally typed out the idea on one page at 8 in the morning. I went to see Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader, at 9 in the morning. He told me to return at 10 in the morning, and there was General Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. He said, Jeffrey, explain it to General Scowcroft, and I did. General Scowcroft asked me, is this the best approach? And I said, I think it is, General. And he said, please call Senator Dole at the end of the day. At 5 p.m., I called Senator Dole, and he said, Jeffrey, tell your Polish friends they have their $1 billion. So it was from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., literally. Okay, now, I made a number of recommendations, and I thought, pretty cool, they're all being accepted. And they worked, which is why President Gorbachev asked me for help. And I suggested similar strategies multiplied by 5, because that was the difference of the size, actually at the time multiplied by 10, because it was the Soviet Union in 1991. And Gorbachev was invited to the G7, and I and a team at MIT and Harvard presented what was called the grand bargain to support Gorbachev. This was even before Russian independence. The White House turned it down flat. Didn't even want a follow-up note or memo, just said, we're not giving anything to the Soviet Union. Okay. Then Gorbachev came back from the G7 and was kidnapped, and in that putsch attempt, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant political figure. And by September, Yeltsin had reached out to me, please come to Moscow to help us. So I came to Moscow and I explained, they said, how did Poland stabilize its currency? How did Poland get its debt canceled and so forth? And I explained the dynamics. Well, can this work for Russia? Because we're going to have an independent Russia. And I said, it's important because you face financial collapse. And so this is very important. By the way, all my thinking was guided by John Maynard Keynes' Economic Consequences of the Peace, 1919. Don't end a war in disaster for the vanquished. You end up with what everybody knows. You end up with the risk of complete disaster a generation later. So this was very much on my mind, and I proposed a similar strategy for Russia. It was turned down completely. I said, but it already proved itself. The Secretary of State said to my face in early 1992, Mr. Sachs, suppose I even agreed with you on what you're saying. Suppose the Polish finance minister had said the same thing to me that you're saying. I want to give you a piece of advice, Mr. Sachs. It's not going to happen. Okay, very clear. Being very stubborn on my side, I didn't believe him, because usually anything I've wanted, I've had to argue for. But it didn't happen. It never happened. It didn't happen with Bush. It didn't happen with Clinton. The idea of the United States helping Russia to recover never crossed their mind for a moment. This is the most basic point. Russia's on the outside. We move the Iron Curtain several hundred kilometers to the east, but we still face this problem on the other side. That's the mindset.
And the motivation?
The motivation is being number one.
Destroy
The motivation is being number one. By the way, the motivation was we don't have to listen to anybody. We are the unipolar power. We are the most powerful country in the history of the world. And there's a famous, justly famous episode of Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general under Clinton, going to the Pentagon in the early 1990s and being told specifically in 1992, I believe it is, that we're going to clean up now, clean up all those Soviet-backed governments, Iraq, Syria, Libya, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have a series of wars, he was told. And then after 2001, he was told the same thing. Now we can clean up everything. So this is an idea. It's a concept. It's a concept of state power, not a healthy one. And it's been deeply seated, and we're still at it. And these events are playing out in real time right now. They're extremely dangerous, and they're bringing us back to the brink of nuclear war. Because Russia does not want a US-led unipolar world. China does not want a US-led unipolar world. Indeed, outside of the EU, United States, UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, nobody else wants a unipolar US world. So we have the West, so-called, with about maybe 15% of the world population, and the rest of the world saying, what are you doing? Could you make peace and calm down rather than breaking everything? Now, let me end by saying I'm not exonerating Russia's responsibilities. I'm saying that we could have avoided this conflict and we could end this conflict now. But we cannot end it on US terms of NATO enlargement. There is no path to that possible. So until we understand that, we will have the risk of escalation and we will have war. The only way to end this is on a path that respects Russia's perceived security interest in not having NATO in Ukraine. And when we accept that, a lot will be possible. Thank you very much.